Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for staying on after the brunch and at this very final set of symposiums here this afternoon. My name is Barrett. My co-chair is James Stubbs, and we will be chairing this symposium, which will talk about the NoHoW project, some of the achievements we have done so far in the project. And I have just put on a few slides that I'm hoping. Okay. We have a set of presentations that will talk about the NoHoW project. And for those of you who have not heard about the project or have not heard about the progress of the project, I'll just briefly go through and tell you that NoHoW is a project that is trying to establish new ways to help people maintain long-term weight loss. It has several components. It has a first component of establishing evidence and informing the trial that we're conducting about weight loss, and we will be hearing some results from some of that evidence foundation today. We have then in the project built a toolkit, an ICT-based toolkit that will help people maintain their weight loss via motivation, self-management, self-regulation, emotion regulation. We're currently testing the toolkit in a large European RCT. We have finalized the baseline measures and the enrollment successfully of 1,600 people into the trial. We'll follow them up for a total of 18 months, so we're not there yet, but we have begun rolling people into the 12 months follow-up. And then, of course, eventually we will share everything we've learned from this. But today, we will share with you the first set of results that we have from the trial and from the evidence foundation for the trial. We are 11 partners from 5 different countries across Europe, and it was a project that was funded by the Horizon 2020 program. The people that we have enrolled is, as I said, a little over 1,600 individuals that were all overweight or obese prior to enrollment, but also was only enrolled if they had lost more than 5% of their initial weight in the previous 12 months. We completed baseline information and baseline collection March 2018, and we have follow-ups 6, 12, and 18 months to come. Now, I won't be talking anymore, but in a few seconds, give the microphone to James Stubbs. He will be going through some of the background, some of the theoretical basis that are underpinning and underlying the NoHoW project. We will then hear from Susanne Pedersen about some of the results from the more qualitative part and aspects of the study. This is a qualitative study on differences in food intake and self-regulation among the shorter and long-term weight maintenance. This is our second publication in NoHoW. We're very proud about that. We'll then go on to Elizabeth Evans, who will talk to us about some yet unpublished findings from a 12 months longitudinal survey we have performed among 2,000 UK-based overweight people who have lost weight. We'll go on from there to have 2 short presentations by Ina Husenovic and Christiana Duarte, who will give you a first glance of the baseline data, the characteristics of the 1,600 people we have enrolled in NoHoW. And then we will be hearing from Marta Marquez about a consensus development that we have initiated around weight loss maintenance and weight loss maintenance interventions. And there will be a discussion following that last presentation. But without further ado, I would like to ask James to come and introduce all of us to the background and the theoretical basis behind NoHoW.
Thank you, Barrett. Is this mine?
Yes.
Oh, so weird. It's, no, okay. So thank you, Barrett, for that really comprehensive introduction. In terms of weight loss maintenance, I think conceptually, at the moment, there are three things. Weight loss maintenance itself, why we're interested in it, the energy balance framework, and how perhaps to achieve it in an energy balance framework, behaviorally. So we all want to achieve long-term weight management solutions. It doesn't matter whether we are scientists, commercial organizations who've got big investment in that area, whether we are governments. It has shaped research priorities. And the reason why is because if you look at policy documents, governments recognize that most of us still die of non-communicable diseases, and a central pathway to non-communicable disease in which we can intervene is body weight. So if we can achieve sustained weight management, we can improve, hopefully, people's health well-being. And if we can keep that weight off for a long time, we can hopefully reduce the prevalence and development of non-communicable diseases. So, if you like, as professionals, we're all on board with this idea. Actually, the public is pretty on board with this idea too. You won't be necessarily surprised to hear that the CDC, 10 years ago, asked the US public, how often do you try to lose weight? 42% of the US public said at least once a year. A recent review and meta-analysis across the world by Santos et al., over 1 million people, concluded it's pretty much the same deal. In the NoHoW project, and I don't think Lizzie's going to talk about it today. She's going to talk about another aspect of the surveys and the observational work they've done. But we've done a 3-country survey and found pretty much the same thing. So a very significant proportion of the adult population claims that they are making some kind of weight control attempt with annual frequency. And for whatever reasons, they get it wrong. It doesn't work out. And those reasons can be multiple and many. It can be stress and life events. It can be physiological compensation, which is a whole area we won't talk about today. It's the environment we live in. There's also a big component of having a lack of knowledge, a lack of skills, and subscribing to popular rather than evidence-based approaches. And NoHoW is really about evidence-based approaches. So we can see obesity as something that develops over the life course, and once it's there, it's a long-term condition. It's chronic. People attempt to do something about it, and they relapse. And when you have a long-term complex condition, there is no simple point cure. There is only management, which takes us to the issue of how do you help people manage that. And it's not just in Europe that we've had this issue. We've had this issue also in the US, where they've built a framework, a conceptual framework, to articulate in energy balance terms how appetite, hunger, motivation to eat changes, how physical activity components change in relation to weight loss. And that stuff brings you back to where you came from. And what they suggested is we need aspects of motivation, cognition, maybe a bit of pharmacotherapy, to help people sustain those changes in energy intake and those changes in energy expenditure that will keep the weight off. And it's a kind of a similar deal in what we're doing in NoHoW. People go through a cycle, they lose weight, they find it difficult, their efforts become sporadic, they relapse. So what we want to do is break that cycle. And the question in terms of self-regulation and emotion regulation, which is the third component I want to tell you about, is if you went to the evidence and said, what is our best bet to do that? The answer would be the best prospective psychosocial predictors and behavioral predictors of longer-term weight loss are self-regulation of eating and activity behaviors. There's very suggestive, tantalizing evidence out there that stress, emotion regulation, and enhanced well-being will enhance self-regulatory effects and enable us to better control eating. So if you want to build a toolkit to do this stuff, It should have self-regulatory content. It should have emotion regulatory content. It should help people with their motivation, because self-regulation is one thing. If they're not motivated, they don't self-regulate. And it should have some element of personalization, and we kind of covered that stuff last year, so I don't think we're going to go into it today. And the reason for doing it digitally is it'll be cheap, we can maximize scale, save ourselves a bunch of euros, and have a big impact. So we have built a toolkit that fits around those concepts. It comes in 4 versions. It contains aspects of self-regulation, aspects of emotion regulation, a combination of the two, because we have 3 hypotheses that self-regulation and or emotion regulation may influence weight and weight loss maintenance. They might interact, and you also need to test it against a control. So as Barrett just suggested in a similar kind of slide, we built this innovation and exploitation pathway. And in that pathway, there's a whole work package where we try to understand who we are providing this toolkit for, what they need, the who, what, where, when, how of consumer engagement in weight management attempts. And that's been a very successful work package. Some of it was discussed last year in Portugal. Liz is going to show us some exciting new evidence from a longitudinal study of real weight loss maintainers this year. And Suzanne is going to tell us about the actual experiences of real people engaged in self-regulatory approaches. So we kind of did our homework before we built this toolkit. And we went to the literature, and we theoretically informed the content. So we built logic models which allow us to understand, or to project at least, or predict how the behavior change approaches we have got are going to impact on specific aspects, and using defined constructs to have expected outcomes, or indeed unexpected outcomes. And building that toolkit took 2 years. A lot of testing and retesting. And we got to the point where we can now test the toolkit for a formal randomized control design. And we're at that point now. We are past the baseline measures for all participants, and by March next year, we will be at the 12-month primary outcome point. And that means we can then unlock the data set, crunch all our numbers, build our statistical models, and think about how we can take that stuff we learned and exploit it through commercial approaches. So we built our toolkit, 4 versions. If you're going to build a toolkit in 4 versions and you want to test it in a trial, you've got to have 4 arms to your trial, and the best way to do that is through a 2x2 factorial design. So that's what we did. And then we recruited 1,600 people in 3 different countries, split across 3 different countries, not 1,600 in each one. And the idea is they had to have achieved clinically significant weight loss. So Ina and Christiana will tell us a little bit about the baseline data. We cannot show you any data for outcomes beyond that at the present time, because we haven't unlocked the data set. So they go for this. Have I got a pointy thing? I got a pointy thing. Screen them. They go for a 6-month active intervention, which each week of the active intervention has toolkit content. And depending on which arm you're in, that content is different. So the control has got generic content. They don't really like that. They're not fools. They know it's not that good. The combined arm has self-regulation and emotion regulation. And then at the end of this 6-month active intervention, there's another 12-month follow-up where their toolkit usage is discretionary, and the technology partner VTT is allowing us to collect all the metadata on what they're doing, how they're doing it with the components of the toolkit, which is going to be very useful in understanding how specific components actually shake out in influencing behavior change later on, or not. So 3 European countries, as Barrett said, 1,600 people who had to have a BMI at least 25 before they kicked off, and to have lost at least 5%. And we'll see how they did in a few moments. So we built a toolkit, we've got a trial. Trials have primary and secondary outcomes. Obviously, the primary outcome in this trial is weight. And in weight loss maintenance trials, to me at least, the literature looks like they don't have massive effects. So one of the really exciting things about NoHoW is the way we built that toolkit, the logic models, the 2x2 design, because it allows us to examine a whole range of secondary outcomes. So if it is the way of things that effect sizes, whatever you do, tend to be modest or moderate, then you have to start asking, how can we do this differently? And the way we might be able to do this stuff differently could be by understanding who uses which components and how do those components affect certain outcomes. Do emotional people prefer emotion regulation interventions? Or some people much more geared toward self-regulation? So we've got secondary outcomes that look at what you would expect, health markers, but also psychological mediators of energy balance behaviors, which is dietary behaviors, activity behaviors, stress and emotion. And we can also look at baseline moderators of intervention effects. Throughout this trial, we have tracked energy balance behaviors in terms of weight and physical activity using these things minute by minute. And I think this will become the world's biggest data set. We wanted, I've only got a minute left, I have to be quick. We wanted to look at the first week's physical activity data. Apparently there's 32 million data points for the first week. They're going to wear these things for 18 months. So where does that take us? It takes us to a system, an experimental and interventional system that we've built that allows us to look at behavior change approaches and how they impact energy balance behaviors and how those behaviors influence long-term weight outcomes. Which kind of means we can take this, I love this framework actually, the NIH framework, and we can populate it. Let me try the maths actually. It works. We can populate it with specific measures of eating and specific components of physical activity behaviors. But we can also look at theoretically informed, evidence-based constructs in terms of self-regulation of eating, self-regulation of energy expenditure or physical activity, not directly related, but they correlate well. And also stress management, emotion regulation, acceptance, commitment, self-evaluation. All of the emotive kind of stuff, if you like. And by using the NoHoW design in this conceptual framework, not only will we be able to look at primary outcomes, but we will be able to understand both moderators and mediators of those outcomes in an energy balance framework. And I think this kind of approach will inform the next generation of weight loss maintenance interventions through triaging and personalizing interventions. So throughout the next bit of the symposium now, Suzanne is going to start by telling us about some of the experiences of people engaged in weight loss attempts. And then Liz is going to expand the scale of that to tell us about the experiences of people who really are truly at their own chosen target weight and how they stay there, what helps them and what doesn't. Then we'll go on to look at a quick peep of the baseline data in the NoHoW trial. Thanks.
Thank you, James, for not only sticking to time, but also delivering a very, very nice overview. I think we can have one or two questions if there are any at this time. We can have a discussion afterwards as well, but if there are any questions at this moment, we can take them. And if not, I would like to welcome Suzanne on the stand to talk about self-regulation of food intake among short and long-term weight loss maintenance, qualitative findings from the NoHoW.
Yes, thank you, Barrett. I'm Susanne from the Aarhus University in Denmark, and I conducted this study together with these colleagues that I mentioned here, and some of them you will hear later. And that's right, as James also said, I went out and talked to real people about their self-regulatory strategies. And this is what I'm going to tell you today. First of all, I have no conflicts to disclosure. When it comes to weight loss maintenance, it has been defined as losing at least 10% of initial body weight and keeping it off for at least 6 months or even more. It is really hard to achieve because not only do you have to lose weight, but you also have to maintain it. And it can be really hard to break those unhealthy habits that you might have. And the risk of regaining is very high, as I'm sure you have also heard about at this conference. There's a recent review by Greaves and his colleagues saying that these behavioral changes that are needed to maintain weight loss can create some sort of psychological tension. So I think it's fair to say that you should be really cautious when you maintain, because it's a hard process. It's not the end point of your weight loss. In this study, we were interested in the food intake and how that, what role it plays in weight loss maintenance. And we don't think of food intake as merely eating, but a whole range of interrelated behavior. And that is something like planning your meals and your food intake, it's shopping, it's storing your food, cooking your food, dealing with impulses, cues, and social norms. And all of this are kind of embedded in people's daily routines and social activities, their normal life, and that is what we wanted to do. We wanted to understand, okay, where are the challenges when it comes to weight loss maintenance in this area. I'm sorry. So we think it's very important to know what self-regulatory strategies people are using when it comes to these different food-related behaviors. And also we found that it was sort of under research whether there was a difference between short-term maintainers, and we have defined them here as those who have maintained for less than 12 months, and the more long-term maintainers who were able to maintain for more than 12 months. So that is how we defined it here in this little study. So the aim of our project was to explore the self-regulatory strategies and also the self-efficacy beliefs for food intake applied by both short-term and long-term maintainers, and to obtain a better understanding of the challenges and how they applied the different strategies. We did 18 semi-structured interviews in the central Denmark region. We had a few sampling criteria, or not just a few, actually quite a bit. They should be above 18 years of age. They should have an initial BMI of at least 25 or more before weight loss. And they should have lost at least 10%, so a clinical significant weight loss with no regain. Also, it was a criteria that they had to maintain for at least 2 months. And we recruited them through different ads, local general practitioners. We entered weight loss groups on Facebook, and in general we used this snowballing strategy. We interviewed 15 in person and 3 by Skype. And the interviews lasted around 1 hour and a half, and of course were recorded and transcribed. And here's just a very short characterization of our participants. We ended out with having 9, what we define as short-term maintainers, so between 2 and 12 months. Oh, thank you. And we had 9 that had maintained for more than 12 months. And as you can see, we have an overrepresentation of females. Mean age are sort of not always, all the same, but approximately. You also can see that the initial BMIs were much higher from the short-term maintainers, and therefore also the current BMI. If you see the, can I point with the mouse, maybe? Yeah. You can see the long-term maintainers were actually below the 25 in BMI, while the short-term maintainers were still overweight. And that is, of course, one of the limitations of this study. You can question, well, are the short-term maintainers really only maintaining, or do they have further goals, even though they stated that they were done with their weight loss? That is something that we would say is a limitation to this study. And you can see they all lost, the short-term maintainers lost 21% and the other 25%, so we are dealing with someone who is very successful with weight loss. And the short-term maintainers had spent 8 months, 8 months for their weight loss, while the long-term maintainers have spent almost 21 months. And you can see the mean in terms of weight loss maintenance in months is 5 months for the short-term maintainers and almost 1.5 years for the long-term maintainers. So definitely there were some differences, and we thought that was really interesting to see how they differ in the self-regulatory strategies. And just to give you an overview, I thought I would just present it to you, so I'll go through these different stages and give you a few examples of the self-regulatory strategies and some quotes and so on. So when it comes to planning of food intake and meals, there was a clear tendency that the short-term maintainers had a stronger need for planning or for action planning, while the long-term maintainers, they also planned, but they also relied on these good habits that they seem to have built. I had one long-term maintainer saying, well, if I feel that my good habits are slipping, I plan my food intake for the next couple of days just to get sort of back on track. I also had another one saying, well, I always have peeled carrots in the fridge. If I want a snack, I always go there first. So that was her way of planning, not eating more unhealthy stuff. So she knew it's a good habit to keep this in the fridge because then I'll learn myself to go there first. In terms of the short-term maintainer, this is just one example of how she would plan. I mean, she would write a meal plan and put it on the fridge for everyone to see, because she was then reminded every time she entered the fridge, she would know, oh, this is my meals for the coming week, and so on. So that was a few examples of the strategies in terms of planning. When it comes to shopping and storing, again, the short-term maintainers followed a grocery list. They did this meal-to-meal planning. They lived by what I've called self-restriction through non-availability, so living by, I don't eat it if I don't buy it. So really thinking about not eating or buying or storing items that they actually didn't want to eat. And not buying these things also sort of strengthened their beliefs in that they could maintain. The long-term maintainers, I mean, they improvised a bit more when they were shopping, but again, without jeopardizing the weight loss maintenance efforts. They seemed to be more flexible, so they didn't avoid any foods completely. They knew how to get back on track again. And we have one man here, a 4-month weight loss maintainer, saying, well, my grocery list is what I use when I shop. It keeps me from looking at all the offers. So he was very strict using the grocery list. Then I have this more long-term maintainer saying, well, I just buy huge, huge amounts of vegetables. It is more improvisation. So she explained that, okay, she just bought whatever she saw, what she liked, and then she improvised when coming home and finding out, okay, what do I do with these amounts of vegetables? When it comes to preparing and cooking, it seems to be so that the short-term maintainers would like to experiment with new ingredients, trying to build new habits, taking certain foods instead of cream. Maybe they used spread cheese and to make a sauce and so on. And they were also thinking ahead, trying to prepare larger batches. So they knew that, okay, maybe I don't have that much time for cooking food throughout the week, but if I can prepare big batches, maybe that will ensure that I will have or be more successful in terms of thinking about my weight loss maintenance. The long-term maintainers had very strong self-efficacy beliefs when it came to maintenance, and they also were good at improvising with the ingredients, and they were sort of ensuring some supportive food preparing strategies. And also they said, well, preparing food is actually a mindful aspect now to me because I'm doing something good for myself. I'm maintaining my weight loss, so that is why I decided on enjoying it and make it a nice thing for myself. So the short-term maintainers, I have one saying, well, we cook a double portion. It's a lot of work, but then we have it structured, and overall it saves time. And that was said in the context of not just saving time, but also making sure that she will not jeopardize her maintenance of her weight loss. And then I just included a quote on one of those who found it more as a mindful thing to cook. She said, well, cooking used to be something that I wanted to be done with as quickly as possible. Now I actually enjoy it. It's fun trying out new foods and techniques. It's like a break for me. So she found herself more at ease with cooking, and it was not such a hassle anymore because she was doing something good for herself. In terms of eating, there was quite some similarities between the short-term and the long-term maintainers. They all had cues to control the portion sizes. That could be the size of the plate. It could be pouring the portion on the plate and then leaving the pots in the kitchen. Also, both types of maintainers showed flexible restraint, and they also seemed to form some habits in terms of eating same type of meal. So if they found that, oh, this works for me as a breakfast, then they tend to eat that. Maybe not every day, but almost. And the same with lunches and so on. Especially the short-term maintainers also showed some sort of trade-off strategy, and I have an example I'll show you in a bit. And they also had this experience with getting back on track, that they were able to do that. That helped them build some self-efficacy beliefs that they could actually go back on track. And that was also very evident in terms of the long-term maintainers. But also, when it comes to the long-term maintainers, there was one saying, well, I have learned that I won't die from feeling hungry. So that was her cue that it is okay. I don't have to eat whenever I feel bored or just a little bit hungry. So she said, well, that is something you really have to learn and allow yourself to feel hungry. And this is just an example of this trade-off strategy that a number of the short-term maintainers expressed. I have this man saying, well, I can fancy a burger or a big pizza, but I managed to catch myself and say, no, you really don't want to do that because you know how much time you need to spend losing it again. So he had this trade-off, oh, is it worth it? And I also had some long-term maintainers who also had this sort of trade-off strategy still. In terms of the barriers and resources, the social norms were definitely barriers. And for the long-term maintainers, I mean, social acceptance, knowing that, okay, you're keeping your weight loss and so on, that helped build their self-efficacy beliefs in terms of maintenance. And they have also built self-control as a stronger resource. And they were able to deal with lapses more efficiently because they know eventually they will lapse, but it's all about getting faster back on track and that the lapses don't last for that long. For the short-term maintainers, they try to get help from the social context. So letting people know that they were maintaining their weight or trying to avoid different things like buffets and so on could help them build this self-efficacy in terms of maintenance. And also they were really struggling with building this self-control, and I just included, again, a few quotes. I had one long-term maintainer saying, now, if I have a day with bad food choices, I'm quicker to get back in the saddle. It does not last for several days or weeks as earlier. So being very confident that she could be back on track, and that also shows some flexibility. And for the short-term maintainer, I had this one woman who were talking about dining at a restaurant, and she said, well, normally you would think that, oh, I have paid for this food and then I have to eat it. And then she figured, well, yes, I have to pay for it, but what is it that I am paying for? I pay for the food, but when I'm full, I would rather leave some than pay by being fat. So she was very aware of social norms. Yeah, when you pay for food, you should eat it and all these sort of things, but she was like, no, I've had it. Now I try to build my self-control instead. So just to conclude, there was some overlap between short and long-term maintainers in terms of eating and dealing with barriers and utilizing the resources helpful for weight loss maintenance. And there were differences when it came to planning, shopping and storing, and preparing and cooking behaviors. And we think that our results indicate that weight loss maintainers have to find and adapt sort of their own combination of self-regulatory strategies that support weight loss maintenance, but it also has to fit with their own food-related life situation. I just want to say thank you. I think time is up, and if you want to read more, as Barrett said, it's published, so you can see it here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. We can have 1 or 2 questions now, if there are a few. Yeah, Maaike, please. State your name and where you come from, please.
Thank you. Maaike Kruseman from Geneva. I have a question about the group, the short-term weight loss maintainers. Did they consider themselves as maintainers, or were they still in the process of trying to lose more, which could also explain part of the differences between both groups?
Yeah, I mean, that is also what we put as one of the limitations in our study, but actually they had to do a screening survey beforehand where they stated, yeah, I'm done losing weight, now I'm maintaining, and we also asked about this during the interviews, and they again stated, yeah, I'm done with the weight loss, now I'm maintaining, so, but again, I mean, it can make you question whether that is actually true. That's true.
Oh, thank you for the talk. I'm Marie Garavasi. I'm a GP in Sweden. I work in an obesity unit also. My question is, do you have some knowledge? Do you think these long-term maintainers, do you think they changed strategy, that they might have had the same strategy in the beginning? Or are these the people, do they get to be less rigid? They're not, even the short term is not rigid in your study, but do you understand that?
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean. I would say definitely, because the short-term maintainers, I mean, when they explained how the strategies in weight loss maintenance, they say, well, it's some of the things are similar to what I did during my weight loss, but I'm a bit more flexible. And then we had the long-term maintainers say, well, I'm even more flexible. I know I will not jeopardize my maintenance if I have one day where I eat something else. So I think they really are able to build a stronger self-control and self-regulation. But it takes time, evidently, I think. So, I mean, it could be interesting to see where, I mean, maybe in a more quantitative study, see where does it really change.
Do they develop
and
adapt their strategy? Or
yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, again, thank you very much. And we will now hear from Liz Evans, who will enlighten us and tell us about the results from the 12 months longitudinal survey among 2,000 UK-based weight loss maintainers.
Okay, well, lovely to speak to you, and I presented the overall regression results for this yesterday, the overall predictive model for weight loss maintenance. So today's talk really focuses a little more on emotion regulation, self-regulation, and the relationships amongst them in the process of change during weight loss maintenance. So if anyone here also saw my talk yesterday, it will not be exactly the same. I'm sure you're relieved to hear. So first of all, I've got no conflicts of interest to disclose. And also this slide seems to go slowly, so let's see if we can, there we go, we've changed. So I've been involved in building the evidence foundation for this intervention, which is work with separate samples of participants. So none of the people I worked with are those that took part in the trial. What I will report today is results from a 12-month longitudinal study of people who were trying to maintain weight in the UK. So again, these are not trial participants. It's a study of naturalistic weight maintenance in the population that had already achieved their goal weight. The key research questions I will speak to today are within the context of the fact that we still don't know what are the population determinants of sustained weight loss maintenance in general population samples where weight loss has not happened through an RCT. and our study benefits from having objective weight measurements rather than just self-report, which tends to be the case with general population surveys. So today I will speak to relationships between weight loss maintenance and self-regulatory variables, relationships between weight loss maintenance and emotion regulatory variables, and finally, last but not least, how these two things seem to interrelate over time, how they change together over the process of maintenance. So the data I report today are for 2,352 participants who gave us data at 3 time points. These time points were 0 months, baseline, 6 months, and 12 months. And it includes primarily a sample of women. There are about 2,100 women and about 200 men. Men were very much underrepresented in this sample. But I've examined these relationships split by gender, and actually you do see very similar relationships, which was interesting. For these individuals, we got objective weight data at all 3 time points from weight records held by a slimming organisation that people had lost weight with. This is a slimming organisation people had spontaneously joined. It wasn't a trial they came into. We simply contacted them using the slimming organisation's mailing list and invited them to be part of this observational study of maintenance. We also asked them about some psychological and behavioural variables, and these are some of the ones that we asked about. I will speak specifically about the regulatory variables, self-regulation and emotion, but we also got the weight history, talked about habits, adherence to weight management plans, their eating, physical activity, and various other things. So this is what the distribution of weight loss maintenance looks like. So we can see that at 6 months, people had gained under 1 kilo from their starting weight. And at 12 months, on average, people had gained about 1.5 kilos with standard deviations that were about double the initial gains. And what you can see in the histogram is actually some people lost quite a lot more, but the majority of people were staying around their goal point. We checked that these were people who were trying to maintain by asking about their motivation to lose more weight. Broadly, most had absolutely no motivation to lose more weight, but extremely high motivation to maintain it. So we think we've got quite close to a true maintainer sample, as much as we possibly can, within the context of this sort of survey. And people had lost, on average, about 15% of their body weight. So even if though they did regain a little, 90% of people remained 5% below that start weight before they'd lost weight. In other words, they would be considered to have maintained clinically significant weight loss over the 12-month period. So we had a lot of very successful maintenance within the sample. So we found that physical activity actually increased over the study as assessed using moderate vigorous physical activity minutes per week. Explicit intended dietary restraint actually decreased, and intuitive eating responding to biological hunger cues, that sort of thing, increased. We found that the explicit levels of planning and motivational variables for weight loss maintenance decreased over the study. You would potentially expect this because people may be planning less explicitly, less formally, less effortfully. As they get better at maintaining, planning potentially becomes more intuitive and less articulated. We also found that emotion dysregulation, stress, and depressive symptoms decreased over the course of the study. So I apologise for all the correlational tables, but I will tell you the broad brush stories. So if you look at the baseline levels of all these self-regulatory variables, you've got action control, which is the extent to which you exert executive functional control of your weight management activities. You've got action planning and coping planning, so that's setting out plans for weight loss maintenance and planning for when stuff might go wrong. That's coping planning. Self-efficacy, so the belief that you can maintain weight. The automaticity of healthy eating. How habitual are those healthy eating choices? And levels of motivation. Autonomous motivation is the motivation you experience coming from within yourself, being self-guided. Controlled motivation is the expectation that other people would like you to do things. So you can see one is somewhat intrinsic, and the second is somewhat extrinsic. You can also see that overall motivation for weight loss maintenance is represented here. When we look at the baseline scores, you can see that we're getting some statistical significance because it's an enormous sample, but these are very weak correlations. As such, baseline levels of this sort of activity were relatively unpredictive of weight loss maintenance at the 12-month point. So baseline predictors were really not accounting for very much variance in weight loss maintenance. However, when you look at the change in the self-regulatory variables, you see a different study. And one thing I should apologise for now is that we have 3 sneaky asterisks that have come down here that should not be in the table. I do apologise, it's my 3rd talk in 2 days. So what we see is this far stronger association in change in self-regulation with weight loss maintenance, such that people who exerted lower levels of self-regulatory control, they actually gained more weight. People whose self-efficacy dropped over the period gained more weight. People whose motivation decreased gained more weight. The only exception was controlled motivation here, despite what the asterisks say. Levels of controlled motivation didn't make so much of a difference, but autonomous motivation, that intrinsic internal motivation to maintain weight, was strongly linked to weight loss maintenance. So what we're seeing is the change scores account for the process of maintaining weight to a greater extent, and we're beginning now to do the mediation and moderation analyses to tease out some of these relationships statistically. The data were relatively recently received, so I apologise for not presenting these mediation analyses here. So those are the self-regulatory variables. What we see now are the emotion regulation variables. So you've got emotion dysregulation, the inability to manage emotions effectively. You've got depressive symptoms and stress which speak for themselves. You have self-criticism, the extent to which you criticise yourself, and then self-compassion, which would be the inverse, a compassionate attitude to yourself. And then you have 3 types of eating represented here. You have binge eating, grazing, which would be picking on stuff through the day but not compulsively eating a large amount, and then eating in the absence of hunger, which would be eating despite not feeling physically hungry. Again, the associations of these levels at baseline with weight loss maintenance are relatively weak. We are hitting statistical significance, but these are fairly trivial correlations. What we see is that there is far less of a relationship with the change scores compared to the self-regulatory variables. So emotion regulation is not accounting for a great deal of change in weight loss maintenance. These change scores here, because of the way we calculated them, we did see that there is a weak link between increased binge eating severity, increased eating in the absence of hunger, and weight gain. But again, it's relatively low. So we're not seeing the relationships we saw with the self-regulatory variables. This seems to suggest that the self-regulatory variables may be more actively involved in the process of maintaining weight. And finally, we have the relationship between the two. This is the last correlation table, I do promise. So what we saw is emotion regulation was particularly strongly associated, although these are still relatively weak correlations, with the self-regulatory variables, such that people who had higher levels of emotion dysregulation were doing less planning. They had lower self-efficacy, eating was less habitual for them. They had higher controlled motivation, so people who were emotionally dysregulated had extrinsic reasons for maintaining weight, and they had fewer intrinsic reasons for trying to maintain weight. And what we saw was overall motivation was related there. You see very, very, very similar relationships with depression and stress. In other words, the higher the level of emotional dysregulation, the lower the level of self-regulation. And these are change scores. So as emotion dysregulation, stress, and depression went up, levels of self-regulatory variables across the board basically decreased. In other words, there seems to be sort of a trade-off. If you are emotionally regulating well, you are perhaps able to exert these self-regulatory behaviours on your maintenance process. But if you have high levels of depression, stress, inability to manage your emotions, then the ability to enact these regulatory behaviours that you need to keep your weight in the right place, those are diminished. And again, we're modelling how these things work together and predicting weight loss maintenance at the moment. But it seems that there is an interaction there. It's not simple additive contributions to the whole thing. So let me see if I can, yes. So I would like to acknowledge my colleagues at Newcastle, Falkirk Newhouse, Kirby Sainsbury, and all the partners in the NoHoW consortium, many of whom are represented here today. And thank you for listening. I would appreciate any questions at this preliminary stage of looking at the data.
Thank you very much, Liz, for sharing this with us. Questions for Liz? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Katja. I'm from Denmark, from Novo Nordisk, actually.
Hello.
Very, very interesting results. Just to help me to put them together.
Yeah.
Do your results basically mean that if you measure executive function at the beginning of the intervention, you can then maybe stratify your populations to specific toolkits or parts of your toolkit?
That's an absolutely intriguing suggestion. We didn't take direct executive function measures, so action control would be the extent to which you would use your executive faculties to plan out, to sort of implement your weight management. So if I speak to that, then I would say that baseline levels are relatively trivial when it comes to predicting weight loss maintenance success, because those correlations were really quite low.
Yep.
What I did find and what I reported in my talk yesterday was that emotion dysregulation at baseline was a significant predictor of overall weight loss maintenance. So if anything, it would be more important potentially to measure emotion dysregulation as opposed to the more self-regulatory activities at baseline as a guide to how weight maintenance might go and where you might offer support.
Yep.
So we seem to support lots of self-regulation in our interventions because many of us are health psychologists. But actually emotion regulation might be one of the things that would be most important to know about people at baseline. But I can see there being a whole different project where we look at cognitive faculties of people before they start interventions. And in fact, I'm sure there is some good literature on that. So really interesting idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Liz, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure, James.
In data sets like this, there's usually quite a big attrition effect.
Yeah.
So, and it's a weight loss maintenance data set, which should constrain the variance in the outcome as it progresses longitudinally. One, how does that affect the models? And two, what can we do with the missing data?
I don't know. I mean, A, I'm not a statistician, and they would definitely be the right person to answer this. But B, our attrition was not that high in this sample. Right. We have baseline email addresses from people, about 3,000 of them, and then 2,300 gave us data for the rest of the study. So I'm not anticipating it being that hard to model because also levels of missingness within participants were really quite low. I think it's, without a doubt, we're going to have to be using growth curve modelling, particularly if we use detailed weight records for people, where we've got 52 weights for some people in the year preceding joining the study, and for others we have 3 weights. So that I don't know how to navigate. But all I can say is probably complex. It's probably complex. Do you have some ideas?
I think, well, it strikes me that because it's a weight loss maintenance data set and the concept of weight loss maintenance is nothing's going to happen, the ones who successfully do it means that the variance in outcomes is constrained.
Yeah, we also can't do baseline outcome carried forward because that would equal maintenance, which is precisely not what you don't want to be doing.
But I think there are you could make assumptions to interpolate the missing data. You could assume that there's the last observation carried forward. You could assume that those from the last observation regain certain amounts. So and there are multiple methods which would probably be useful to compare.
I think we have to use a number of different ones and see the extent to which they influence our outcomes and then make a pragmatic decision based on that.
So you know what the effect of the assumptions is.
Absolutely. If various methods make virtually no difference to our outcomes, it hopefully will be an academic question, literally and figuratively.
Okie doke. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for listening.
We now have a split presentation, but we're doing okay for time, so we can chill out a little bit, I think. Firstly, Ina Husinovic is from Sweden, is going to tell us about weight history and the characteristics of the baseline measurements for the cohort in the NoHoW trial. This is the first time we've ever shown anything, I think, to describe who these people are and what they look like. And then Cristiana Duarte is going to talk a little bit about their self-regulatory and emotion regulatory characteristics and how they might relate to each other, following on from what Liz just said. Thank you, Ina.
So thank you for that introduction. Yeah, very happy to be here to share some of the first results of the baseline data from the NoHoW trial. So I have no conflict of interest to declare. So my part will be to present the data on weight loss history in relation to clinically significant weight loss as we define the weight loss at baseline in the NoHoW trial. So starting with some background, we know that nearly all treatment-seeking individuals with obesity report at least one previous weight loss attempt. And weight loss history has been suggested to affect weight loss outcome. However, previous literature shows some conflicting results on how weight loss history relates to future weight loss attempts. One hypothesis suggests that frequent past weight loss attempts may lower motivation and confidence in future attempts and/or be a marker for struggle in maintaining new lifestyle behaviors, thereby suggesting that fewer previous attempts would be beneficial. On the contrary, we have an alternative hypothesis suggesting that practicing coping with lapses can potentially improve self-efficacy and increase the chance of a positive outcome, and thereby suggesting that greater number of previous weight loss attempts would be beneficial. So the aim of this presentation today was to describe weight history in the NoHoW trial and examine baseline weight loss across weight history traits in the trial. And I would like to emphasize that these are preliminary results and that they may change later on after further analysis. So as Barrett and James have mentioned, I will just summarize. NoHoW trial, including 3 countries, the UK, Denmark, and Portugal. And in total, 1,600 participants approximately have been recruited, who have all lost at least 5% weight loss during the last year. The baseline data that we will be presenting today has been collected during the last year, and more specifically, the questions on weight loss history were also collected at the baseline visit using a questionnaire. So, if we start by looking at the study population in the NoHoW trial, these are some background characteristics. And if we start by focusing on the measured body mass index at the baseline visit, we can see that this group of individuals have a BMI of 28.6 at the baseline visit. And we can also see that approximately 40% of the trial participants were classified as having obesity. 1 year later, prior to the baseline visit, the participants had a self-reported body mass index of 32.2, and at this time point, approximately 67% of the participants were classified as having obesity. If we look at the baseline weight loss, we can see among all participants a weight loss of 10.3%. And we can also see by this picture that women had a slightly higher weight loss at baseline compared to men. Then if we move on and look at weight history in relation to some background characteristics, and I've chosen to focus on the weight history variable number of previous weight loss attempts resulting in at least 5 kilo weight loss. So this variable was collected using the following categories. And if we start by looking at age, we can see as the number of previous weight loss attempts increase, we can also see that age increases, and this is what we would expect. Moving on to baseline body mass index, we can see the same pattern. So greater number of previous weight loss attempts is related to greater baseline body mass index. If we look at gender, we can see that women report a greater number of previous weight loss attempts compared to men. So in the extreme category, we can see that 9% of women compared to 5.5% of men report achieving this weight loss more than 10 times prior in their life. Looking at country, we can see that Denmark stands out somewhat with reporting greater number of previous weight loss attempts. If we compare Denmark and Portugal, we see quite a big difference between the proportion reporting at least 10 previous attempts with this weight loss but this could also be related to some age differences that we have seen between the participants in the Portuguese sample and the Danish sample. And finally, for marital status, we can see that the individuals who state that they are divorced or separated are the ones who report the greatest number of previous weight loss attempts. So moving on to some associations between weight history and the baseline weight loss. So I will present 4 weight history variables, more were collected. And when talking about baseline weight loss, we have defined this at the percentage weight loss that the participants had lost during the last year before trial enrollment into the NoHoW trial. So starting by looking at the number of previous weight loss attempts, resulting in at least 5 kilo weight loss, we can see that the majority of the trial participants report achieving this weight loss 1 to 2 times prior in their life. And we can see that this specific variable was not related to the baseline weight loss in the NoHoW trial. As for the variable age at first weight loss attempt, again, we can see that the majority of participants report being between 20 and 34 years of age at their first attempt. And we can also see that this variable was related to the baseline weight loss, with greater weight loss among those who were younger at their first weight loss attempt. The participants were also asked, on average, how long do you maintain your efforts to lose weight? And here the majority reported longer than 3 months. And although this variable also was related to the baseline weight loss, we can see by the numbers that the difference between the categories was very small. And finally, on the question, looking at your previous attempts, how often do you tend to slip back or relapse? The majority of the participants answered quite a bit, and we can see that this variable was not related to the baseline weight loss. So if we try to summarize these first preliminary analysis of the baseline data, we can see that younger age at first weight loss attempt and longer duration of previous weight loss attempts were related to greater weight loss at enrollment into the trial. So what we are now all interested in examining is if these characteristics, these weight history variables, also are related to the prospective weight loss maintenance that we will follow during the trial. And by that, I would like to hand over the word to Christiana.
Good afternoon. So following from my colleague's presentation, I will now be focusing on describing the characteristics of these participants in terms of emotion regulation, self-regulation, and how these 2 constructs may interact. So first of all, I have no conflict of interest to declare. So yes, this presentation will focus on describing the population in terms of other variables of their weight loss history, self-regulation and motivation and emotion regulation, and how emotions, self-evaluation, emotion regulation may have an impact in energy balance behaviors, and how these may interact and may be associated with weight loss outcomes. So in terms of weight loss history, and I'm just going to give you some descriptive values here, we found that using a 5-point scale that participants declared that they struggled quite a bit with losing their weight, and also the amount of relapses during their weight loss attempts were quite high. And in terms of the perceived helpfulness of factors that help them to lose weight, most participants said that self-determination was a key aspect, so their willpower to lose weight, the knowledge, being aware of actually what to do to lose weight, and also the support from family and friends. And in terms of the weight loss methods that they have been using during their weight loss journey, most participants said that healthy eating, self-monitoring their weight, and exercise were the most important factors. And this is in line with other studies looking at similar populations and also with the weight control registry. So these results are quite similar. So the 2 main factors are really healthy eating and exercise. They play an important role for weight loss.
And in terms of the self-regulatory skills and motivation that these participants presented, we could see that participants scored quite highly in terms of action planning, coping planning, and in terms of basic psychological needs key for psychological well-being. We could see that participants scored quite highly on autonomy, so a sense of self-determination, willingness to engage in weight loss management efforts, and a sense of volition and self-determination in this aspect. Also competence, the actual capability of engaging in weight loss maintenance attempts, and social support and relatedness. And in terms of their intrinsic and extrinsic goals for weight maintenance, they also scored quite highly, and also self-efficacy. And in terms of self-regulation of these two important aspects in weight loss, exercise and eating behavior, we could see again that participants present at this point high levels of autonomous motivation and lower levels of controlled motivation. So this may indicate that participants, before entering the trial, already presented a significant amount of self-regulatory skills. And in terms of emotion regulation, we could see that participants presented slightly lower levels of self-criticism that we see in other similar populations, and also lower levels of external shame, and high levels of self-compassion, the ability to be compassionate, accepting of themselves, psychological flexibility around body image, and also the ability to live a valued life, a life that they enjoy living, and also mindfulness skills. And they present similar levels of difficulties in emotion regulation that we see in the general population. And in terms of eating behavior, we could see that these participants presented similar but slightly higher levels of the ability to eat intuitively, and similar levels of eating restraint, susceptibility to hunger and disinhibition, and power of food, and also similar levels of binge eating symptoms of what we see in other populations with similar characteristics. And we see that we were able to see that around 18% present moderate binge eating symptoms and 4.4% severe binge eating symptoms. And this is important because this is an outcome that we will be looking at in the NoHoW. So binge eating symptoms as a proxy of difficulties in regulating eating behavior is an important variable that we'll be looking at. And in terms of how self-regulation and motivation and emotion regulation interacted or related in these participants at baseline, we could see that as expected, self-regulation and motivation aspects are associated negatively. So action plan, coping plan, autonomy, competence, motivation are associated negatively with negative self-evaluation, so self-criticism, shame, and are also negatively associated with difficulties in emotion regulation, and are positively associated with positive indicators of adaptive emotion regulation, so self-compassion, mindfulness, and an accepting, flexible relationship with body image. But the associations were not very strong. They were in the expected direction, but the strength of the associations were small to moderate, which indicates that self-regulation and motivation, and on the other hand, emotion regulation, are two different constructs, two different aspects related to weight loss and weight loss maintenance. And so these are two different pathways, and in the NoHoW, we are interested in seeing how these two different pathways interact and may be combined to achieve longer-term weight loss maintenance. And so I'm going to share with you a preliminary finding in which we try to combine and try to see how these two components may interact and account for weight outcomes. Please bear in mind that these are correlational data, and things might change slightly prospectively, and as we saw from Liz Evans' presentation, the change in these variables may play an important role here. But so in this path analysis, we were interested in understanding the relationship between negative self-evaluation and difficulties in emotion regulation, and how were these associated with difficulties in regulating eating behavior and weight loss attempts, and how difficulties in emotion regulation interacted with autonomy, so this sense of self-determination, volition, willingness to engage and stay in helpful weight maintenance strategies, and so how these aspects interacted. So what we saw was that shame, so negative self-evaluation around body weight and shape cognitions and experiences had a significant effect on increased binge eating symptoms and also on weight loss attempts, and that difficulties in emotion regulation significantly moderated the effect of autonomy on binge eating symptoms and weight loss attempts. And at the end of this path analysis, we entered percentage weight loss at baseline, but the relationships, the amount of variance explained is very minimal and possibly accounted by the large sample that we are using here. So, but this gives us some direction on how these aspects may interact and explain weight loss and weight outcomes in this population. So prospectively, we are looking forward to see how these aspects interact over time. So to summarize these results, we could see that negative self-evaluation, and here we focused on shame, perceptions, is associated with loss of control of eating and is indirectly associated with weight loss attempts, and that difficulties in emotion regulation may impact the effect of autonomy to engage in weight management efforts, which may impact self-regulation of eating behavior. But the effects at this point, looking at this cross-sectionally, the effects on weight loss attempts are limited, and so we need to look at this prospectively, and so hopefully next year we could give you some more information on this. So thank you very much.
We've got time for a quick question. Oh, yeah, for both bits of the presentation, whichever.
I have a short question for you. Just which instrument did you use to assess the binge eating symptoms?
It was the binge eating scale. So it gives us, it's a scale that has been widely used because it focuses on the cognitive, behavioral, and emotional aspects on binge eating, and it can give us a dimensional perspective of binge eating symptomatology. So here we are not focusing on binge eating episodes, but we are focusing on this perception of uncontrolled eating behavior from a dimensional perspective.
Were you surprised that there was no direct path between autonomy and eating difficulty, eating disorders?
Yeah, there was no direct effect, so it indicates that this association is mediated and influenced by other variables that we are working on in the project. So I think it's very interesting to see how these associations are not straightforward. They are influenced by other mechanisms, and we are combining those mechanisms, which I think is very interesting.
Sean Wharton from Toronto, Canada. Terrific presentations. I was just wondering, were you able to, when you were looking at, let's say, the different parameters in terms of the number of times somebody had attempted to lose weight, so it's more of a question for the first speaker, really. Did you control for the confounding variables? Because each of these variables is going to impact on each other. The age of the person is going to impact on the number of times they've binge eaten. It's going to impact on their weight is going to impact on how young they were when the first attempt is of losing weight. So it's almost like asking if you're a slow runner, why are you running so slow? It's because of all these factors, and it relates to the fact that you're running. So they're all confounding on top of each other. So they're always going to be the same parameter. So was that looked at?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So in these slides, all other weight history variables were corrected for, adjusted for.
And you still saw those specific impacts.
Yeah.
You corrected for all.
Yeah, so adjusted models were adjusted for all other weight history variables, but for the crude model, we only run the country adjustment. So we had both. So the one to the left, to the right, the adjusted model was adjusted for all other variables we looked at. Yeah.
And it still continued to, be a factor.
We saw quite similar results between the crude and adjusted models, so going at the same direction. Yeah, thank you.
So, the weight loss maintenance is an increasingly popular theme. There have been one or two, I think to me at least, surprises in this area, one of which we've just seen, that we thought we'd have real difficulty in recruiting people to a trial like this. Difficulty in recruiting people who've lost 5% of their weight. Turns out mean weight losses are 10%, and I've seen that now across several studies. It also turns out that we shouldn't perhaps expect really big effect sizes in these kind of studies in the primary outcomes. And that leads us to a debate and a discussion about, so if it's like smoking cessation, if only 20% of people actually pack in smoking the first time you do it, how can we make it better? Which leads us to the need to think about and develop a consensus regarding weight loss maintenance provision and the kind of services we might want to generate, develop, and put out there in the future. Marta Marquez from UCL is going to lead us into this section, talking about how we can move towards a consensus in developing the next generation of weight loss maintenance interventions.
Thank you, James. Hi, everyone. So I'm conscious that we don't have that much time left. Just a brief overview for those of you that weren't here at the beginning of the symposium, and also to explain where the consensus project comes in within the NoHoW. So it was explained at the beginning, if you look at the NoHoW model, the idea is to build an entire approach to weight loss maintenance across Europe, starting with evidence foundation, and we had 2 presentations about that. Going to building a toolkit that can be used digitally to have a higher level of reach and uptake, and then test this toolkit, and then finally share these results with different kinds of stakeholders, with potentially commercial companies, with other researchers, etc. And within this level of thinking of how we can share and disseminate and be able to make the NoHoW a useful project in the long term for different stakeholders across Europe, there was the idea of developing this consensus project and this consensus approach. And I'm going to talk about this work in progress. And at the end, we'll have a few minutes where I will launch a discussion and also have your views of what you think that can be useful within this consensus. So how did this idea started? We do not have an international level consensus of what to do when it comes to weight loss maintenance. And for those of you that are practitioners or those of you that are researchers, you know that still the definition between what is weight loss maintenance, what are the differences in terms of practices, what are the differences in terms of strategies that we discussed today is still in its beginnings. We're still doing research, we're still having this debate, and when you look at the guidelines, there is still vague and very few information about it. So doing the research in NoHoW and with all the experts that we have involved in this consortium, we realized that there was a need to have a more international level consensus. We are aware that some countries like the UK have gone a long way on doing this. Other countries like Portugal have very few guidelines when it comes to weight loss maintenance. At the same time, if you want to establish evidence-based practices for effective interventions, we also have to consider that we still have gaps and implementation barriers. And this is also linked with a lack of knowledge and a lack of good information that we can use then based on to develop our work when it comes to sustained weight management. Again, we don't know what providers do across Europe in terms of weight loss maintenance, what are the differences, what is the support, and if we don't have this kind of consensus, it's really hard to have a systematized way of doing practice, and this also has an implication in terms of research, because if practice is not systematized internationally, then we don't have a good basis to do research, see what it works, and how we can improve services. So both things are very linked. Another important aspect is the recent shift in terms of research and policy of considering obesity as part of a whole complex system approach. So thinking about the individual, the communities, the families, the organizations where we are, and the collaborations and how this has links in terms of communication and in terms of the treatments that are put in practice. So there has been this shift of thinking how we can work together and think of the individual within a complex system. If we think of a complex system or a whole system approach, it also brings a lot of complexities in terms of how can we integrate evidence-based research into the systems when a lot of our research has a clear separation between focusing on the individual and behavior change and focusing on what is the environment and other policies. And this is something that has been discussed during this conference, sorry. So the main aim of this project is to develop an expert consensus-based set of priorities and recommendations for long-term weight management practices. So the entire purpose is to think of what are the challenges and priorities in terms of research, but also in terms of practice. And from the evidence that we have so far, what can we recommend when we bring together different experts with different backgrounds? What can we recommend in terms of long-term weight management practices? And what we don't know so far and we cannot recommend. So to achieve this, step one will be to develop a survey exploring the provider's views, challenges, and strategies that are used to weight loss maintenance. And I will tell who these stakeholders are. And then in step two, we are going to use the information from the study and develop a Delphi process in which we are going to use the key themes identified in step one, and then we are going to build this consensus exercise. So the target population are key stakeholders involved in obesity management. So this can be practitioners, specialists, and other specialist commissioners, public health, anyone that is involved in sustained weight management treatments, and also considering what is the role of the individuals and the patients in themselves, and we are still thinking of how the survey can address these different stakeholders. The survey is delivered with the support of EASO, and it's going to be delivered online using Qualtrics, so very common online platform that I'm sure most of you know. And it's going to have an initial pilot to test how comprehensive, how coherent it is, if it is well accepted, and its duration. The main aim, as I mentioned before, is to understand exactly what we need consensus on. So what are the key points that we need to have international guidance, international recommendations to provide better weight management practices in the long term, and think about the strategies associated with that. So you can see in the slide just some examples of questions that we are building, such as what is the distinction between weight loss maintenance, and weight regain prevention? Does this make a difference in the way that you use it in practice, the strategies that are used? Do the services where you currently work have any guidance on how to deal with different patients that come at different stages? What are the enablers and the barriers to weight loss promotion? And what is the support to also implement evidence-based practice? And as I said before, focusing on a whole system approach. We are also considering and currently thinking how we can use behavior change frameworks to inform the survey. So one of the purposes in NoHoW is to bring behavior change research in terms of theories and techniques and knowledge and bring this to promoting sustained weight management. And thinking about the survey and thinking about this whole complex system approach, using behavior change frameworks can be very useful. And here you see an example of the behavior change wheel, which is one of the most widely used behavior change frameworks. And the basic idea, we don't have time to go through all of this, but the basic idea is that we need to consider the sources of behavior, so what you see in the green part of this wheel, And the sources of behavior are the determinants that have to do with individual in terms of motivation and capability that you heard earlier today, but also the opportunity. And these determinants of behavior have influences on both the practitioners, both the commissioners, the patients, the public health specialists. All of these stakeholders have different sources of behavior that have an impact on the way that they daily deal and the guidelines that are built in terms of weight management and weight loss maintenance. And we need to capture these determinants for these different stakeholders. And then if you look at the outer side of the wheel, you see intervention functions. And what this is saying is that the way that we provide recommendations and the way that we choose what are the strategies that we are using in our interventions, in our treatments, comes from the sources. So if we don't identify exactly what are the sources of behavior, we don't know which interventions and which techniques or strategies are useful to impact on the stakeholders who in turn will improve their practices when they are developing guidelines and treatments for obesity. And then here in the gray part of the wheel, you can see the policy categories. So these are all the regulations and everything that is in place in the organizations and in this complex system that will have an influence on how far we can go with the recommendations. So if we don't assess what is going on in different countries, in different regions, in terms of the guidance and the practices that are in place for obesity and weight management treatments, we cannot put in practice the rest of the wheel. So one of the purposes of the survey is to try to analyze and try to get to the bottom of all of these areas and all of these parts of the wheel that have an impact, and then build a consensus based on this. So step 2, the expert consensus procedure, as I said before, derives from the survey and from this analysis that we are going to do with the survey, and it has 3 rounds, so it's a typical Delphi procedure. In round 1, we are going to ask open-ended questions based on the survey to have a broader understanding on the experts' views. So these open-ended questions are based on their survey, but they still allow the experts to provide more input in terms of what is happening on weight loss maintenance treatment. Then we use these responses, we conduct a meta-analysis, and from this, we develop core statements. So these core statements are recommendations, are statements related with what are the strategies that can be used, what are the limitations on research, what are the key aspects in terms of treatment. And then, and then in round 2, we ask them to rate their agreement with the statements. So we use Likert scales, and we just present the statements and ask stakeholders to say if they agree on a 5-point Likert scale with the statements presented. And from this, we have an inter-rater agreement that is going to be established using formal consensus agreements. And then in the Delphi procedure, what is done is we use the answers from round 2. So we use the average of those answers, and we present again to the stakeholders. So we present the statements, and we say in the previous round, this number of stakeholders answer, or this was the average answer for statement A. Would you like to keep your answer? How would you rate it now? And then we present the rating again, and you can either choose the same or you can choose a higher or lower number. And the idea is to see also what are the influences based on rethinking about the statement again and knowing what the other stakeholders actually replied. We haven't yet decided how this is going to be presented to different stakeholders. As I said, this is work in progress at the moment. So the way we thought of finishing this talk about the consensus is actually to get your views about aspects that you think are really relevant and should be in this exercise. So as I said at the beginning, the idea of the consensus exercise that we can involve all of you and all the experts in Europe that work with weight management in building something that is useful. So we have here 2 major questions. You may want to comment on these questions or ask anything else or related with this. What is quite relevant is to understand how these services look like in your country. So what is done in terms of weight loss maintenance? Is there a distinction between weight loss and weight loss maintenance, and how this reflects? And what are your experiences with working with other practitioners and commissioners in promoting weight loss maintenance? And of course, you don't need to answer this now. You can get in touch with us, send your ideas by email, follow us on Twitter. We'll be asking all of this, that. But I open the floor for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, for laying out this very clear to everyone. Some questions or comments from the audience? Please go ahead, state your name and where you're from, please.
Thank you, Marta. My name is Sven Schubert. I'm an EASO Patient Council member from Ireland. Thanks for your presentation. It's really interesting. I'm post-bariatric surgery myself, so weight loss maintenance and regain prevention or management is an issue for me personally, so it's very close to my heart. I'm wondering, because the current focus, so weight loss management seems to be in its infancy. We're just about out there with making surgery an acceptable treatment to the payers. So they're much more reluctant to value weight loss management. I was wondering, is there a connection, and is it feasible to exploit the connection to prevention? Because a lot of the measures you would apply to prevent obesity will be helpful to manage weight loss and maintain weight loss, and like obesogenic environments, etc. So is this part of your study? Are you interacting with the preventers?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Do you want to, James?
I think we both probably contribute to that answer. One thing that's, I think there are now a good handful of big prospective weight loss maintenance data sets, whether they're either observational or there's been an intervention. I think the concept of weight loss maintenance per se is tricky. And it reflects more the goals of the investigator rather than the participant. Many participants who engage in these studies do not want to maintain their weight, they want to lose more weight. I think it might be helpful as part of our consensus if we agree that a common focus is the prevention of weight gain and regain rather than this concept of weight loss maintenance. The only data set we really saw, and I've ever seen, where you've got people who are absolute weight loss maintainers are people who've achieved what they state is their goal target weight. It's not the National Weight Control Registry, and it's not a number of data sets that we commonly call weight loss maintenance data sets.
Again, a question for the entire group. Sean Wharton from Toronto. When we're looking at weight loss maintenance, we're looking at the small subset of people trying to lose weight and keep it off over the long term. So, and when Rena Wing and James Hill looked at the National Control Registry and the people that lost weight, looking at all the analysis of what they did to lose weight, and you try to apply those principles to people who are trying to lose weight, it doesn't really work. So what people are doing to maintain the weight doesn't necessarily translate to help the people who are trying to also get there. They'd like to be on that ship, and they're trying to use the same methods that the people who are on that ship losing weight are using, but they don't get to that goal because of other reasons, physiology reasons and other types of mechanisms. So those behavior modifications do not work for them. So is there any thought of where this is going to go in terms of your analysis? If these people were able to maintain their weight loss because of these methods, now what do we do with that information?
I think Liz is the best person to answer that based on the results from the first NoHoW studies.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think the National Weight Control Registry is a very interesting population. They're very self-selecting. They're not typical of the general population. They're people who not only lost weight and kept it off, but went to the trouble of joining a registry specifically around maintenance. As such, I don't think it's particularly surprising that when you try and apply some of the strategies that they've identified on a general population level, or just ordinary folks try and use them, they're not always that helpful. We have a paper under review at the moment that looks at what people in the real world, who we have approached to talk about weight, are doing to try and maintain. And what we've seen is many people do not have a maintenance concept. You have the sprint, you have the exciting weight loss where actually, if you're lucky, it's hard work, but you get to the weight loss, and then you have the arduous marathon, which is the rest of your life to keep the weight loss. And we don't even have a commonly used phrase, we don't have terminology to communicate with the public about what maintenance is and what it really means. As such, it shouldn't be surprising that the public struggle to understand evidence-based weight loss, but in terms of maintenance, we can't even start the conversation when there's no concept, no concrete shared understanding. So I think I've deviated slightly from your question, but in terms of why these techniques don't seem to be generalizable, I think I can speak very easily to that, and that's that the general population is several steps behind the individuals involved in the National Weight Control Registry, and also the average person, when they lose weight, they're quite glad to have finished doing all the difficult things, and they don't necessarily want to engage with additional things to keep it off for all that time. So there's a motivational barrier, there's a knowledge barrier, and there's also a research barrier in terms of effective strategies. And I think all of those speak to the effect that you're talking about there. Does that contribute to answering your question? Okay.
It's also just pointing out, because you mentioned the issue of physiology. It's very interesting that there is a lot of big physiology that speaks to weight regain and may even drive weight regain, particularly at large amounts of weight that are lost. So even if you go back to the Second World War literature, people, regardless of how overweight they were or not, who have lost 25% plus of their weight, start showing big physiological adaptations in terms of structure, function, and behavior. But when we're talking about therapeutic weight loss in the general population, we're really in the 0 to 10% zone. And so I think what we're talking about is we need a better understanding of what we and they are aiming for, and we need a better understanding of the way physiology and behavior interact in that zone in a wider proportion of the general population.
Maaike?
Thank you. Just to reflect a little more on that, I was wondering if we're not on the path of doing the same mistake we did with obesity, is putting everybody in the same box, like weight loss maintainers, because there are probably many different types of weight loss maintainers. There are those of the National Weight Control Registry, and there are all these patterns of people who apply. For now, they're looking for themselves for the right strategies, but you have those who practice a lot of physical activity and regulate their weight like that, and others who will be on a restraint, loss of control pattern, etc., etc. And I think we really need to define better these various patterns in the population. There are those who are subject to metabolism modifications, but it's not the rule. There are many people who have just a normal metabolism even after weight loss. So I think it's difficult to try to define just one big model, because there are so many different groups of people with weight loss maintenance.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think that's the beauty in NoHoW,
yeah.
is that we're not going to solve the entire problem, but it's an amazing step to start looking exactly at that. So I think that NoHoW starts with the premise that there aren't just one type of weight loss maintainers. I think that's kind of the basic idea. And there aren't just one type of factors, there are many factors, there are many interacting factors, and there are many things going on. And what we are looking, and James presented that a bit at the beginning, we're thinking of this idea of getting to a personalized approach in the future. And what we are assessing in NoHoW in terms of looking at different emotional regulation aspects, different self-regulation, behavioral aspects, different motivational aspects, having data on physiological parameters, having data on physical activity, on their dietary habits, all of that will allow us to start drawing that picture of what are the different types of people that we have when we talk about long-term weight management, and also considering that there might not be one a type of people, but people that have different factors going on at different stages of the weight management process. But with this kind of data, you can actually look at that. And I just put this slide because this is a bit of an idea of when we think about that, is exactly identifying what are these factors that you see on green. What is it going on in terms of the individual? What are the different aspects that will then allow us to be able to understand how to intervene with these different individuals?
I think we need to think about the type of models we're using. We are not going to have models where you can pigeonhole groups of people where specific factors explain large proportions of the variance. It doesn't work that way. You get lots of factors explaining very small proportions of the variance. And when you try and zoom in on those factors, as people do in a reductionist way, they fragment into even smaller factors that explain less of the variance. So what we need to do is where we're talking about moderation and mediation analyses, is trying to articulate how those factors relate to each other, the interventions that we're using, and the populations in which we're using. And you can do it above the skin in terms of psychology and behavior, and you can do it below the skin in terms of physiological resistance to weight loss. The big picture is, can we ever join those two domains together? What happens under the skin during dynamic changes in energy balance speak to behavior through changes in physiological signaling and function.
And on that note, on the complexity of all this, I'd like to close this symposium. Thank those of you who are still here for being here over time. I didn't want to stop the discussion because I thought it was so good. But thank you very much, and thank you to the speakers for presenting so excellently.